Welcome back to the Holy Land Path.
It's great to be here.
We are continuing our special ongoing series on the apostles of the New Testament. Today is episode 2 of the series, where we follow the footprints of the early apostles out into the Greco-Roman world.
And it's a really exciting one today.
It really is. Now, to start us off today, I want to bypass the typical images we hold of the ancient biblical world. Forget the quiet, dusty villages in the Judean hills.
Right, the typical Sunday school picture.
Exactly. Forget the serene shores of the Sea of Galilee. Instead, I want you to put yourself in the sandals of an ancient Mediterranean ship captain, like right in the middle of the 1st century.
Oh, that is a stressful job.
Highly stressful. You are hauling this massive cargo of, say, Egyptian grain or maybe rare spices from the East, and you are desperately trying to get your goods to the markets in Rome. But there's this terrifying obstacle in your way, a geographic nightmare known as Cape Malea.
Yeah, and it was the absolute dread of the ancient mariner. I mean, Cape Malea sits at the very southernmost tip of the Peloponnesian Peninsula in Greece.
Right at the bottom there.
Right, and the weather systems crashing together there, they created these violent, unpredictable gales and just terrifying currents. And, the seafaring technology of the 1st century.
The wooden ships?
Yeah, wooden ships with these large, square sails.
Yeah.
It was just not built to handle it. The death toll around that cape was, well, it was staggering.
There was even a famous ancient proverb about it, wasn't there? The saying went, when you double Malea, forget your home.
Oh, wow. Yes.
Just imagine heading out to work and knowing the prevailing wisdom is like, if you take this route, you are never going to see your family again. You are going to die at sea.
That proverb alone tells you everything you need to know about the fear it instilled. I mean, shipwrecks weren't just a possibility down there. They were a high probability. So as a ship captain hauling a literal fortune in cargo, you're constantly looking for a way to cheat death, like a way to bypass that southern cape entirely. And that geographic desperation is exactly what birthed the immense, almost unimaginable wealth and the chaos of ancient Corinth.
Because Corinth provided the ultimate shortcut.
Exactly.
And so this is the mission for our deep dive today. We are going to unpack a stack of incredible archaeological and historical sources, ranging from, the famous Gallio Inscription to the highly debated Erastus paving stone.
Oh, that's a good one.
It is. And we'll go all the way to the social dynamics of ancient dinner parties.
Yeah.
We want to uncover the intense socioeconomic and political realities the Apostle Paul faced when he walked into this roaring metropolis of Corinth.
It was a chaotic place.
It really was. And most importantly, we are going to demonstrate how digging into the dirt of Greece brings the pages of Acts and the epistles to life, profoundly affirming the historical accuracy of the scriptural record you hold in your hands.
It is a remarkable journey of discovery, really, because when you talk about the physical remains of Corinth, you start to see that the biblical text isn't just floating in some ethereal, spiritual vacuum.
Right.
It's deeply anchored in a very real, very gritty historical reality. And to grasp that reality, we have to look at how they solved the geographical nightmare you just mentioned.
Right, so let's look at the map for a second.
Yeah.
Greece is basically divided into 2 large land masses. You have the northern mainland, and you have this large southern peninsula called the Peloponnese.
Right.
And connecting those 2 massive chunks of land is a tiny, narrow strip of earth. It's barely 5 miles wide, called the Isthmus of Corinth. And the city of Corinth basically sat right on top of that land bridge, acting as a gatekeeper.
Which means they held a complete monopoly on human movement. I mean, if you wanted to travel by land from northern Greece down into the southern peninsula, you had to physically walk through Corinthian territory.
You have no choice.
No choice at all. They controlled the north-south terrestrial traffic completely. But the real money, the unbelievable wealth that funded the opulence of the city, that came from the east-west sea traffic.
Right, because of those terrified ship captains we talked about.
Exactly.
The Corinthians capitalized on that fear by building 2 massive critical port cities. So on the western side of the isthmus, sitting on the Gulf of Corinth, was the port of Lycium. This was the gateway pointing straight toward Italy and the capital of Rome.
And then on the other side?
Yeah, just a little over 5 miles to the east, on the Saronic Gulf, they built the port of Cenchreae, which faced Asia Minor, Syria, and the eastern provinces.
So instead of sailing south and risking their lives and their cargo around Cape Malea, merchants would sail into one of these 2 sheltered ports.
So it's a detour.
A very lucrative detour. Let's say a ship is arriving from Ephesus in the east. It docks at Cenchreae. The crew unloads the entire cargo, puts it on wagons, and transports it 5 miles across the dry land of the isthmus.
Just hauling it all over land.
Yep. Then they simply load the cargo onto a completely different ship waiting in the western port of Lycium, and that ship sails safely on to Rome.
I am so glad we are unpacking this, because it wasn't just the cargo they moved, was it? For the smaller vessels, they actually moved the ships themselves.
They did.
They engineered this mechanism called the diolkos. I remember studying this and just being absolutely floored by the sheer human audacity of it.
The diolkos was an absolute engineering marvel of the ancient world. It was a paved highway made of limestone blocks that stretched all the way across the isthmus, connecting the two bodies of water.
Like a road just for boats.
Exactly. And down the center of this paved road were two deep grooves, acting almost like modern railroad tracks.
It functions like a miniature ancient Panama Canal, but like without any of the water or the locks.
Right, it's all dry land.
They would sail a ship up to the shore, pull it out of the water, and hoist it onto a massive wooden trolley.
Which is just crazy to picture.
It really is. Then, using a combination of animal power, so oxen and mules, and just sheer brutal human slave labor, they would physically drag the boat across 5 miles of solid ground, over the hills of the isthmus, and just drop it back into the water on the other side.
The amount of labor and infrastructure required to maintain the diolkos is staggering. But the tolls the Corinthians charged for this service were astronomical.
I bet. They had them cornered.
They did. By controlling this 5-mile stretch of land, Corinth essentially set up a toll booth for the entire Mediterranean economy. The wealth pouring into the city was constant and immense.
Wow.
But that wealth also brought a very specific type of culture. Corinth was essentially a boom town.
A completely cosmopolitan transit hub. You would have sailors, merchants, wealthy elite, and slaves from every corner of the known world all colliding in this one space. But here's the thing that really surprised me in the research for this.
Oh, was it?
When we read about Paul visiting Corinth, we naturally think of it as an ancient Greek city. Like, we picture Greek philosophers and old Greek traditions. But the city Paul walked into was actually incredibly young. And it wasn't really Greek at all in its political soul.
That is a crucial piece of the historical puzzle right there. The original Greek city of Corinth, like the ancient powerhouse, was completely wiped off the map long before Paul was born.
Wiped out completely.
Utterly destroyed. In 146 BC, the Achaean League, which was a confederation of Greek cities led by Corinth, they made the fatal mistake of rebelling against the expanding Roman Republic.
Oh, you don't do that.
No, you do not. Rome sent a general named Lucius Mummius to crush the rebellion, and his retribution was absolute.
I mean, the historical accounts of what Mummius did are genuinely difficult to read. He didn't just defeat their army, he systematically eradicated the city.
It was brutal.
Every adult male was put to the sword. The women and children were rounded up and sold into the slave markets. He looted all the priceless Greek art and shipped it back to Rome. And then he ordered his legions to burn the city to the ground.
Nothing left.
For a full century, one of the greatest cities in the world just sat there as an abandoned, scorched ghost town.
It was a monument to Roman vengeance, really. The ruins sat desolate until the year 44 BC, when Julius Caesar recognized that leaving such a strategic geographic choke point empty was just terrible for the empire's economy.
Right, they were losing out on all those tolls.
Exactly. So Caesar ordered the city to be refounded, not as a Greek city, but as a Roman colony. He named it Colonia Laus Iulia Corinthiensis, which, honors himself.
Typical Caesar.
Very typical. And the people he sent to populate this new city weren't aristocratic elites. They were predominantly freedmen, former slaves, along with military veterans and urban poor from Rome who were just looking for a fresh start.
So you have this massive influx of people who have everything to prove and everything to gain. They are handed plots of land and business opportunities in what is essentially a frontier boomtown, even though it's built on these ancient ruins.
Right.
And then, a few decades later, in 27 BC, Caesar Augustus elevates the city's status even further. He makes Corinth the provincial capital of the entire Roman province of Achaia.
Which fundamentally changes the DNA of the city. I mean, scholars describe first-century Corinth as having a hybrid identity.
What does that mean practically?
Well, physically, you are standing on the soil of Greece.
Yeah.
But the civic institutions, the language of the government, the legal system, and the architecture were aggressively Roman.
Oh, I see.
When they rebuilt the public square, the Forum, they designed it to look like a miniature Rome. They were projecting imperial power. This wasn't the old Athens with philosophers quietly debating in the Stoa.
Right, no quiet contemplation here.
No, this was a loud, ambitious, highly competitive, deeply Roman administrative and industrial center.
Let's talk about that industry for a moment, because it connects directly to the lived experience of the Apostle Paul. Corinth wasn't just moving other people's goods, they were a massive manufacturing hub in their own right.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources highlight the production of fine bronze metalworks, and specifically their pottery, which was exported everywhere. But the sheer volume of transient people sailors docking for a few days, merchants setting up temporary shops, delegates traveling to the provincial capital, it created a massive demand for temporary housing and equipment.
And that demand sets the stage perfectly for Paul. When we open Acts chapter 18, we read that Paul arrives in Corinth and seeks out a Jewish couple, Aquila and Priscilla, who had recently been expelled from Rome.
Right.
The text specifically notes that Paul stayed with them and worked with them because they were tent makers by trade.
Tent makers.
Right. The Greek word used is kanopios, which broadly refers to someone who works with leather or heavy canvas to make tents, awnings, and maritime equipment.
It is the absolute perfect place to run a business like that. I mean, you have an endless stream of sailors needing their sails repaired, merchants needing heavy canvas coverings for their cargo wagons on the Diolkos, and travelers needing tents for the road.
It was a booming market.
But this also gives us a vivid picture of how Paul spent his days. He wasn't just standing on a soapbox in a clean, quiet courtyard somewhere.
Not at all.
He was up to his elbows in heavy leather, surrounded by the intense smells of the tanneries, the noise of the bustling Roman marketplace, and the constant bartering in a dozen different languages.
He was entrenched in the working-class reality of the city. And as he sat in that workshop stitching leather, he would have been talking to everyone who came through the door. It was an incredibly effective way to disseminate the gospel.
A brilliant strategy.
But, we also have to remember the spiritual darkness that was hovering quite literally over his workshop.
Oh, the Corinth.
Yes. The city was dominated by a massive limestone mountain called the Corinth, which rose nearly 1,900 feet straight up from the ancient city.
It served as the fortified citadel, right? But it was much more than a military fortress. It was a looming monument to pagan excess.
It really was.
Perched right at the very summit was the Temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Ancient historians like Strabo write that this specific temple was renowned because it housed 1,000 female shrine prostitutes.
1,000?
Yeah, 1,000, who were dedicated to the goddess and would come down into the city at night to ply their trade among the sailors and merchants.
And the entire economy of the city was intertwined with this hedonistic pagan worship. The sexual immorality of Corinth is so legendary across the empire that the Greeks actually coined a verb for it.
Really? What was it?
The word was Corinthiazestai, which meant to act like a Corinthian. And it was entirely a reference to engaging in rampant sexual debauchery.
Wow, so that was their international reputation.
Exactly, that was the reputation of the city. But the spiritual environment wasn't just about revelry, it was also defined by deep desperation, which we can see clearly down in the lower city at the Lerna Asclepium complex.
That archaeological site is just fascinating. The Asclepium was a sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, the Greek god of healing and medicine.
Right.
And the complex had dining rooms, large bathing pools fed by natural springs, and an area where the sick would actually sleep in the temple overnight, hoping the god would visit them in a dream and cure their ailments.
Yeah, incubation, they called it.
But it's what the archaeologists pulled out of the dirt there that tells the real story.
It's incredible. During the excavations, they found hundreds of these terracotta models of human body parts. They found beautifully crafted clay hands, feet, legs, arms, and even human heads.
They are essentially ancient physical prayer requests, aren't they?
That is a brilliant way to describe it. If a Corinthian had a diseased leg, they would go to a local craftsman, purchase a clay model of a leg, and take it to the Asclepium to offer it to the priests.
Just leaving it there at the altar.
Yeah. They would leave it at the altar as a votive offering, either begging the god to heal their leg or perhaps thanking the god if they had recently recovered. When you see these clay hands and feet lined up in a museum today, you can almost feel the tangible anxiety and physical suffering of the people Paul was trying to reach.
I am looking at all of this. The raw commercial ambition, the absolute dominance of Roman imperial power, the rampant normalized sexual immorality, and the deep entrenched pagan superstition.
It's a lot.
It really makes me wonder about Paul's initial mindset. You would think this would be the absolute hardest place on earth to plant a church. It feels like throwing a seed onto a solid sheet of limestone. Why would he commit to staying there?
That's a fair question.
We know from Acts that he ended up staying in Corinth for a year and a half. That is a massive investment of time for an itinerant apostle.
It is a massive investment, but the strategy is genius. You have to look at the very mechanics that made this city wealthy. Because it was the transit hub of the empire, Corinth functioned like a megaphone.
Ah, I see.
If you can plant a vibrant church in Corinth, you don't have to travel to the ends of the earth yourself. The converts you make, the traveling merchants, the transient sailors, the administrative officials passing through, they will take the message of Jesus with them back onto their ships and carry it across the entire Mediterranean basin.
So they do the traveling for him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By staying stationary in Corinth, Paul was effectively evangelizing the whole empire.
But operating in such a high-stakes, intensely Roman environment carries a massive risk. I mean, Paul is preaching a radical message about a crucified Jewish carpenter being the true Lord of the world in a city whose very existence was a testament to the power of the Roman emperor.
Yeah, that's a dangerous message.
It was inevitable that his message was going to collide violently with the Roman legal system.
But that collision was unavoidable. And it sets the stage for what is arguably one of the most critical archaeological discoveries in the history of New Testament scholarship.
Yeah.
The event in question is Paul's trial before the Roman governor, and the artifact that illuminates it is known as the Gallio Inscription.
I want to spend a lot of time on this because it is just so foundational. Let's set the scene of how the stone was actually found.
Kobe, let's do it.
The year is 1905. A team of French archaeologists is conducting an extensive excavation in Delphi, Greece. Now, Delphi is quite a distance from Corinth, sitting on the slopes of Mount Parnassus.
Right, it's quite a ways north.
And in the ancient world, it was universally famous as the home of the Oracle of Apollo, like the most prestigious religious sanctuary in Greece.
And so the archaeologists were digging in the precinct to the Temple of Apollo, and they began uncovering these shattered fragments of a limestone block. They didn't find the whole thing at once.
It was in pieces.
Yeah. Over a period of several years, they eventually recovered 9 distinct pieces of this stone, which had a lengthy message deeply inscribed in Greek. When they pieced the fragments together, they realized they were looking at an official imperial rescript.
What exactly is a rescript?
It's essentially a formal letter of directive sent directly from the Roman emperor in Rome to the civic leaders of a city, in this case, Delphi.
And the text of the letter is dripping with all the heavy, formal bureaucracy you would expect from the empire. It starts by listing out the emperor's massive string of titles. It reads, Tiberius, Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, highest priest, invested with tribunician authority, and goes on to list his various powers.
Very formal.
Very. The actual content of the letter seems to be addressing a population crisis. Claudius notes that the city of Delphi has become somewhat destitute of citizens, and he is issuing a directive for them to invite well-born people from other regions to relocate to Delphi to restore the city's ancient prestige.
From a purely secular historical standpoint, the letter gives some interesting insight into the demographic struggles of rural Greek sanctuaries. But for biblical scholars, the population of Delphi was entirely beside the point.
We didn't care about the population crisis at all.
Not at all. The shockwave came from his single name dropped casually right in the middle of line 6 of the Greek text. Claudius is setting the source of his information about Delphi's troubles, and he writes, as Lucius Junius Gallio, my friend and proconsul of Achaia, recently reported to me.
Lucius Junius Gallio, the exact name holding the exact title over the exact province that Luke wrote about in the book of Acts.
It's just incredible.
Let's look at the biblical text. Acts chapter 18, starting in verse 12, explicitly states, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal.
This inscription represents a monumental intersection between the biblical narrative and secular, verifiable history.
Because it wasn't always accepted, was it?
No, not at all. For a very long time, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a strong movement among critical scholars to view the book of Acts as late romanticized fiction.
They just thought Luke made it up.
Yeah, they argued that the author, writing decades or centuries later, was just making up names and titles to give the story a veneer of authenticity. Some explicitly doubted that Gallio was a real person, or argued that if he was, Luke surely got the administrative title of proconsul wrong.
And then French archaeologists pull a rock out of the dirt in Delphi with a letter from the emperor himself saying, "No, Gallio is my friend, and he is the proconsul of Achaia."
It shuts down the argument completely.
It's carved in stone. It proves that Gallio was a living, breathing historical figure, that he held the highly specific office of proconsul, and that his jurisdiction was the province of Achaia, validating Luke's record perfectly.
But the historical record provides even more depth than the stone alone. We actually know quite a bit about who this Gallio was from other contemporary Roman sources.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was born into an incredibly wealthy, intellectual, and highly connected family in Spain. His birth name was actually Lucius Annaeus Novatus.
Wait, I see. So how did he become Gallio?
Well, it was a common practice among the Roman elite to allow an adult son to be formally adopted by another wealthy family to inherit their estate and political connections. Novatus was adopted by a prominent rhetorician named Junius Gallio, and he took his adoptive father's name.
Okay, that makes sense.
But his biological family is what makes him fascinating. Gallio was the elder brother of Lucius Annaeus Seneca.
Seneca, the famous Stoic philosopher, the man who tutored and eventually served as the chief political advisor to the Emperor Nero.
The very same. Gallio and Seneca were deeply close, and Seneca frequently references his older brother in his surviving philosophical letters.
Oh, wow.
Through Seneca, we get a vivid psychological profile of the man who judged the Apostle Paul. Seneca adored him. In one of his works, Seneca writes, "No one of all men is so sweet to one man as Gallio is to all men."
He sounds like a great guy.
He does. He describes his brother as having an incredibly gentle, affable, and fair-minded disposition. He was essentially known throughout the Roman elite as the nicest guy in the empire, a man who was impossible to hate, who despised flattery, and who possessed a deeply calm and analytical legal mind.
That paints such a vivid picture. You have this highly educated, even-tempered, deeply connected Roman aristocrat sitting in the governor's seat in Corinth, listening to an angry mob drag a Jewish tent maker before him.
Quite the contrast.
It adds so much color to the narrative and acts. But as amazing as the character background is, the Gallio inscription gives biblical historians something infinitely more valuable. It gives us a fixed, indisputable date.
Yes, it is the holy grail of New Testament chronology.
The Holy Grail.
Truly. Without this single piece of limestone from Delphi, pinning down the exact years of Paul's ministry would be largely guesswork. The precision comes from the way the Roman imperial chancellery documented dates.
How so?
Well, in the opening lines of the inscription, Claudius is referred to as being acclaimed imperator for the 26th time.
Explain how that math works for us. What exactly is an imperial acclamation?
So whenever a Roman army won a significant military victory anywhere in the empire, the soldiers would formally hail the emperor as imperator, meaning victorious commander.
Okay.
And these acclamations were meticulously recorded in the official imperial archives in Rome. Through the survival of other monuments, coins, and official decrees, modern historians know the exact sequence of Claudius's reign. We know that his 26th acclamation occurred in the early spring of the year 52 AD, and his 27th acclamation happened by August of that same year.
Which means the letter carved on the stone in Delphi had to be dictated and sent by Claudius within that incredibly narrow window of early to mid-52 AD.
Precisely. Now, we apply that date to Gallio's term in office.
Right.
The province of Achaia was what the Romans called a senatorial province. Unlike imperial provinces, which were governed by military men directly appointed by the emperor for varying lengths of time, senatorial provinces were governed by proconsuls who served strict, non-renewable one-year terms.
And those terms always started at a specific time of year, didn't they?
They did. By law, the new proconsuls had to leave Rome by mid-April to assume their posts in the provinces by early summer, typically around May 1st.
So they were on a very rigid schedule.
Yes. So if Claudius is referring to Gallio as the active, sitting proconsul in a letter written in the spring of 52 AD, it means Gallio's strict one-year term must have run from roughly May of 51 AD to April of 52 AD.
That is just stunning. We're taking a theological narrative from the Book of Acts and anchoring it to a specific 12-month window in global history.
It's remarkable.
Let's trace the timeline backwards using Luke's text. Acts chapter 18 tells us that Paul stayed and ministered in Corinth for a year and 6 months before this massive trial, before Gallio took place.
Right, an 18-month period.
So if we take that 18-month period and work backward from Gallio's term in 51-52 AD, it means Paul likely walked into Corinth for the very first time around the late autumn of 49 AD or the early spring of 50 AD.
It creates a domino effect for the rest of the New Testament. Once you have that anchor point, you can calculate forward and backward to date almost all of Paul's letters.
You can date his entire ministry?
You can date his time in Ephesus, his imprisonment in Caesarea, and his eventual journey to Rome. The Gallio Inscription is the golden spike of biblical chronology. But the actual event that took place during that year, the trial itself, is arguably even more significant than the date.
Let's dive into the mechanics of that trial, because the physical location where it happened has also been dug out of the dirt.
Yeah, you can go there today.
The Jewish leaders in Corinth are furious. Paul is preaching that Jesus of Nazareth is the resurrected Messiah, and he's having massive success. Acts tells us that even Crispus, the ruler of the local synagogue, converts and is baptized.
Which is a huge blow to the local leadership.
Right, so the traditional leadership has had enough. They orchestrate a united attack, grab Paul, and drag him into the center of the Roman Forum to stand before the tribunal. The Greek word Luke uses for this judgment seat is the bema.
And like I said, if you visit the ruins of ancient Corinth today, you can walk right up and touch the bema. Archaeologists excavated it in 1935. It is a massive, raised stone platform situated right in the heart of the city's commercial and administrative center.
It's huge.
It rises about 7.5 feet above the pavement of the Forum, and it was originally covered in brilliant white marble.
It was designed to intimidate.
Absolutely. The bema was the focal point of civic authority. It was where the Roman governor would sit to make public proclamations, address the citizens, and officially hear legal disputes.
So this is where the trial happened.
Mostly likely, yes. Now, I will mention that some scholars suggest that because this was a formal legal trial with religious implications, Gallio might have chosen to hear the case inside the adjacent basilica, which served as a roofed judicial headquarters.
Right.
But whether he was sitting outside on the marble platform or inside the basilica just a few feet away, the physical space of this confrontation is incredibly well documented.
So Paul is standing there, likely chained or held by guards, looking up at this aristocratic, highly educated Roman governor. And the leaders of the synagogue lay out their formal charge. They point at Paul and say, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law."
Which sounds kind of mild to us today.
It does. To a modern listener, that sounds like a minor religious disagreement, something a judge today would immediately dismiss as outside the purview of the state. But in the Roman Empire of the first century, this was a highly dangerous, potentially lethal accusation.
We have to understand the Roman legal framework regarding religion here. The Romans did not believe in the separation of church and state. They believed the state was the church.
They were completely merged.
Entirely. The favor of the gods, what they call the pax deorum, the peace of the gods, was what kept the empire strong. To maintain this peace, the Roman legal system categorized all religions into two distinct groups: a religio licita, which was an approved legal religion, and a religio illicita, which was an illegal, unrecognized, and therefore dangerous superstition.
And what determined whether a religion was legal or illegal?
Antiquity. The Romans deeply respected the concept of mos maiorum, the ancient traditions and customs of the ancestors. If a religion was ancient, even if the Romans thought its beliefs were strange, they generally tolerated it.
And Judaism fit that bill.
Yes. Judaism was recognized as a religio licita because it was demonstrably ancient. The Romans knew the Jews traced their faith back thousands of years.
And because Judaism was a legal religion, the Jewish people were granted incredible legal exemptions across the empire, right? The most important of which was their exemption from the imperial cult.
Yes, that is the crux of the issue. In the Roman world, civic loyalty was demonstrated by offering sacrifices and worship to the emperor as a living god. To refuse to worship the emperor was essentially an act of political treason.
But the Jews wouldn't do that.
Right. The Romans knew the Jews were fiercely, unyieldingly monotheistic. They would die before worshiping a Roman emperor. So as a pragmatic compromise to keep the peace in regions with heavy Jewish populations, the Roman Senate granted the Jews a special exemption.
What was the exemption?
Instead of requiring them to pray to the emperor, the law allowed the Jews to pray for the emperor and his health to their own god.
That exemption was a massive protective shield. So when we look at the trial in Corinth, we see what the synagogue leaders are actually trying to do. By dragging Paul before Gallio, they are attempting a legal maneuver.
A very clever one.
They are drawing a line in the sand and telling the Roman governor, "This man Paul is not with us. He is not preaching historic Judaism. He is starting a brand new, unauthorized sect. He is practicing a religio illicita."
They wanted Gallio to officially sever Paul's movement from the protective umbrella of Judaism.
Yeah.
If Gallio ruled in their favor, Paul would instantly lose that legal exemption. It means he and all his converts would be legally required to worship the emperor. When they inevitably refused, they would be subject to arrest, imprisonment, and execution for treason. It was a brilliant, lethal legal trap.
Which brings us to the climax of the scene. Paul takes a breath and is just about to open his mouth to launch into his legal defense. But before he can even speak a word, Gallio waves his hand and cuts him off.
Doesn't even let him speak.
Not a word. The governor looks down at the accusers and delivers his verdict. He says, "If this were a matter of actual crime or serious wrongdoing, I would hear your case. But since this is just a dispute about your own words and names and your own Jewish law, handle it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And then he orders his lictors, his guards, to drive the accusers away from the tribunal.
It is a stunning dismissal.
Yeah.
And it raises a fascinating psychological question about Gallio's motives.
Let me jump in there, because I look at this ruling and I try to parse out what Gallio was actually thinking. Was he secretly sympathetic to Paul's message? Did he feel some kind of divine nudge to protect the early church?
Right.
Or was he just an elitist Roman aristocrat who was completely annoyed by what he viewed as a trivial squabble among the local populace, and he just wanted to clear his docket for the day so he could go to the baths? Did he have any idea that he was shaping the course of world history?
Well, based on what we know of Roman aristocratic attitudes toward Eastern religions, and Seneca's description of his brother's analytical mind, Gallio likely had absolute zero interest in the theological nuances of what Paul was preaching.
He didn't care at all.
Not even a little. To an elite, educated Roman jurist, a debate over whether a crucified carpenter in Judea was the Jewish Messiah was profoundly irrelevant. He looked at the evidence and concluded that Paul was not inciting a riot, he wasn't stealing property, and he wasn't challenging Roman taxation. Therefore, it wasn't a Roman civil or criminal matter.
But the implications of that apathy are staggering. It acts like a massive Supreme Court precedent for the early church.
That is the perfect way to look at it. Because Gallio was not just a local magistrate, he was a highly respected proconsul whose legal opinions carried immense weight and whose brother had the ear of the emperor.
Right.
By officially throwing the case out and telling the Jewish leaders that this was a dispute about their own law, Gallio effectively codified that, from the perspective of the Roman Empire, Christianity was nothing more than a sect of Judaism.
He grandfathered them in.
He did. His ruling established that this new movement of Jesus followers was covered under the existing legal umbrella of the religio licita.
Wow.
Because of Gallio's decision, Christians across the province of Achaia, and likely far beyond, as other governors would cite as precedent, were granted that same life-saving legal exemption from emperor worship. It created a legal safe harbor. It allowed the gospel to spread unhindered across the Roman road system during those most crucial, fragile early decades of the church's existence.
It is a profound demonstration of how divine providence works through the cold, strict bureaucracy of the Roman legal system. I mean, if Gallio had been having a bad day, or if he had been susceptible to the pressure of the crowd, he could have ruled the other way.
Very easily.
Christianity could have been legally outlawed and brutally suppressed empire-wide before it even had a chance to take root outside the Levant.
But he didn't. He upheld the law as he saw it, and in doing so, protected the apostle. But, while Gallio represents this elite senatorial oversight coming down from the very top of the Roman pyramid, we also have to look at the people trying to climb that pyramid from the bottom.
The locals.
Right. The immense wealth flowing through Corinth created a society obsessed with upward mobility and social climbing. And that ambition brings us to another fascinating archaeological artifact, and honestly, one of the most heated debates in the field of biblical archaeology today.
Let's dive into the Erastus Inscription. To understand why this piece of rock causes so much debate, we have to start with the biblical text. The Apostle Paul wrote the book of Romans while he was living in Corinth, preparing to travel to Jerusalem.
That's right.
In the final chapter, Romans 16, he spends a lot of time sending personal greetings from various members of the Corinthian church to the believers in Rome. In verse 23, he writes this line, "Erastus, the city treasurer, and our brother Quartus greet you."
Now, we need to focus on the specific Greek word Paul uses to describe Erastus's job title. He calls him the oikonomos of the city.
Oikonom.
Right. Broadly speaking, an oikonomos is a manager, an administrator, or a steward of resources. So Paul is indicating that a man named Erastus, who is a baptized believer meeting of the local house churches, holds a significant financial position within the civic administration of Corinth.
Hold on to that thought, because we need to fast forward nearly 1900 years. It is 1929. Archaeologists are excavating a large paved plaza just east of the Great Theater in the ruins of Corinth.
Yeah, major excavation site.
And as they are clearing away the dirt from the paving stones, they uncover a massive limestone block that has a Latin inscription carved deeply into it. The letters are huge, nearly 7 inches high.
And originally, those deep grooves were filled with molten bronze, so the letters would gleam brilliantly in the Mediterranean sun.
That must have looked incredible.
It would have. Unfortunately, most of the bronze was pried out and looted by scavengers centuries ago, but the indentations of the letters are perfectly legible.
It is a striking monument. It is a public billboard advertising someone's wealth and civic generosity. The Latin inscription reads, Erastus pro edilitate sp stravit. Translated into English, it says, Erastus, in return for his edileship, laid this pavement at his own expense.
To grasp why this sent shockwaves through the academic world, we have to understand the role of an edile in a Roman colony.
Okay, what is an edile?
Well, the government of a Roman city was structured around a specific career path called the cursus honorum, the course of honors. The edileship was a very high-ranking elected magistracy.
So they were elected officials.
Yes. The ediles were essentially the city managers. They were responsible for maintaining the public streets, regulating the commercial markets, managing the city's funds, and organizing the public games and gladiatorial contests in the theater.
But they didn't just manage the funds, they were expected to provide them, right?
Exactly the opposite of a modern politician who raises public money to build things. In the Roman system, you had to be personally, staggeringly wealthy to run for office.
How?
When you were elected edile, the public expectation, the political requirement, really, was that you would fund massive public works projects out of your own private fortune as a way of giving back to the city, securing your legacy, and buying the goodwill of the populace for your next political campaign.
So this man, Erastus, paid for the paving of an entire massive plaza near the theater out of his own pocket.
Yes, a massive personal expense.
The parallels are instantly intoxicating. I mean, you have a stone found in Corinth naming a high-ranking civic official named Erastus, who manages public works and city funds. And you have the Apostle Paul writing a letter from Corinth, naming a high-ranking civic official named Erastus, who is the city treasurer. It feels like a perfect, undeniable match.
And for a long time, the traditional conservatives' scholarly view treated it as an open and shut case. Scholars like John McRae and John Goodrich have championed this view for decades.
They believe it's the same guy.
They do. They look at the stratigraphy, the archaeological layers, and argue that the paving stone firmly dates to the middle of the 1st century, right before 50 A.D. They assert that the Erastus who bought the pavement to become an edile is undeniably the same Erastus that Paul calls the oikonomos.
I see why people want this to be true, because the implications for the early church are massive. If Paul's Erastus was a Roman edile, it completely shatters the stereotype that early Christianity was exclusively a movement of the poor, the uneducated, and the enslaved.
Completely shatters it.
It means the gospel had penetrated the very top tier of Corinthian society. It means you had a fabulously wealthy, powerful, Roman aristocratic politician sitting in the same house church, breaking bread with slaves and manual laborers.
It would fundamentally alter our understanding of the social dynamics of those early gatherings. It would mean the early church had incredibly wealthy patrons who could provide large homes for safe meetings, financial resources for Paul's travels, and political cover in a hostile city. However, yes, we have to look at the other side of the scholarly debate because a significant portion of the academic community completely rejects this identification.
I want to hear the pushback because the critical view on this is fascinating. We have scholars like Steve Friesen, who presented a very detailed argument to the Jesus Seminar, arguing what he calls the wrong Erastus theory. What is the foundation of their skepticism?
Well, Friesen and other critical historians urge intense caution on 2 main fronts. The first issue is the dating of the stone.
The mid-1st century date?
Right. While earlier archaeologists dated the pavement to the mid-1st century, Friesen argues that based on a more rigorous analysis of the specific paving style, the surrounding architectural renovations of the theater, and the wear patterns on the stone, the pavement actually dates to the middle of the 2nd century A.D.
So if Friesen is right about the date, this paving stone was laid nearly 100 years after the Apostle Paul and the biblical Erastus were dead. It's just a different, wealthy guy who happened to share the same name.
Yes, and while the name Erastus wasn't the most common name in the empire, it certainly wasn't unique. But Friesen's second, a perhaps stronger argument, is based on social class and linguistics.
How so?
He argues that trying to equate the Greek term oikonomos with the Latin term aedile is a massive historical mistake.
Explain that disconnect for us. Why can't the city treasurer be the aedile?
Because in the municipal structure of many Roman cities, they belonged to completely different social stratospheres. An aedile was an aristocrat, a freeborn Roman citizen of immense private wealth.
Right.
An oikonomos, on the other hand, was very frequently a low-level financial clerk. And in the Roman administrative system, those clerical jobs, managing the daily ledgers, counting the tax receipts, they were almost exclusively held by public slaves or recently freed slaves. They were the property of the city, not its rulers.
That is a staggering paradigm shift. Instead of a wealthy patrician politician, Friesen is arguing that Paul's Erastus might have literally been a public slave owned by the city of Corinth, sitting in a back room crunching numbers on a wax tablet.
Precisely. Friesen argues that eager archaeologists and well-meaning biblical scholars have fallen into bad habits.
Bad habits.
Yeah, he suggests that when they found a stone with a biblical name on it, they forced the connection. They wanted historical validation for the biblical text, or perhaps on a more cynical level, they recognized that highlighting a biblical artifact is a fantastic way to drive tourism, secure further funding, and attract pilgrim dollars to the excavation site.
That is a heavy accusation against the archaeological community. But it forces a very important question. Let's say Friesen is entirely correct. Let's say this stone has absolutely nothing to do with the Erastus mentioned in the Book of Romans. What does that mean for you and me as believers? Does losing this artifact hurt the credibility of the New Testament text?
It is a vital question about how we handle evidence, and it touches on the integrity of our faith. As people who value truth, we must be incredibly careful not to overinterpret artifacts purely because we want theological validation.
We don't need to force it.
Right. True faith does not need to prop itself up with forced evidence or manipulated data. It thrives on honest, rigorous historical context. But to answer your question directly, no, it doesn't damage the credibility of the biblical text in the slightest.
I agree completely, because Romans 16.23 still says exactly what it says. Regardless of whether that specific piece of limestone in the Corinthian plaza belonged to him, Paul explicitly states that a man named Erastus served as the city treasurer and was a brother in the church. The text itself proves that the church crossed complex socioeconomic lines.
That is the key takeaway. Even if Erastus was an oikonomos in the sense of a public slave rather than an aristocratic aedile, he still held a position of significant administrative responsibility.
He wasn't just a laborer.
No, he was literate, he handled the city's money, and he had access to resources and information. A public slave in the Roman administration often had far more practical power and better living conditions than a poor, freeborn day laborer.
So no matter which side of the debate you fall on, you still have a church composed of incredibly diverse social classes trying to figure out how to be a family. And that friction, the tension between the wealthy elites and the working class poor or enslaved, is deeply documented in Paul's own letters. It was actually threatening to tear the Corinthian church apart.
It was a crisis of monumental proportions, and it brings us to a fascinating intersection where the social history of the Roman world crashes headlong into the theology of the early church. We need to examine the politics of the ancient dinner table.
This is so important because as modern believers, we tend to project our current practices backward onto the ancient text. When we think of the Lord's Supper or communion, we envision a quiet, solemn moment in a church pew. Everyone gets the tiny uniform cracker and a thimble of juice, and it takes 5 minutes.
Right, very organized.
But in the first century house churches, the Lord's Supper wasn't a symbolic snack. It was an actual full-blown meal. It was a feast.
It was the central communal gathering of the week. But to understand why these meals were tearing the Corinthian church apart, we have to understand how food functioned in the broader Roman culture. We have to look at the research of sociologists and historians like James Walters, who studies the politics of meals in Roman colonies.
Okay, what did he find?
Walters points us to some incredibly revealing evidence found on bronze tablets from a contemporary Roman colony in Spain, which outline the municipal laws governing public behavior.
The laws actually regulated banquets. Why would the Roman government care who was having dinner together?
Because in the ancient world, food was raw political power. We have to remember the caloric reality of the first century.
They were hungry.
Yes, the vast majority of the population lived on strict subsistence diets. They ate simple, meager fare, mostly barley porridge, a few vegetables, and they drank water laced with a little cheap wine to kill the bacteria. Meat was incredibly rare. usually only eaten after a pagan temple sacrifice. Fine wine and rich foods were unimaginable luxuries.
So if a wealthy patrician decides to throw a lavish, massive banquet and invite the public, it's not just a nice community gathering, it is a calculated political maneuver.
Absolutely. It was the core mechanism of the Roman patronage system. A wealthy patron would throw a feast to buy the loyalty of the lower classes. He feeds you the best meal you've had all year, and in return, you become his client.
You owe him.
You owe him big time. You support his business, you provide physical muscle if he needs it, and most importantly, you vote for him in the next municipal election.
Which explains those Spanish bronze tablets.
Yes. The municipal laws on those tablets strictly forbade political candidates from throwing large public banquets during election years. The Roman government recognized that feeding the starving masses was a direct and highly effective form of political bribery. If you control the food, you control the populace.
Let me bring this back to the biblical text, because this context makes 1 Corinthians chapter 11 explode with new meaning. Paul writes a scathing, furious rebuke to the church in Corinth about their communal meals. He says to them, "When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk."
Trying to visualize that scene, based on what we now know about Roman housing and social status. The church is gathering in the home of one of its wealthiest members because they are the only ones with a house large enough to host a crowd. The wealthy elites, the patrons, don't have to work manual labor, so they arrive early. They take the best seats in the triclinium, the formal dining room. They bring their own massive amounts of rich food, roasted meats, and fine wine. And they start feasting and getting drunk.
Meanwhile, the poorer members of the church, the slaves, the artisans, the day laborers who had to work in the shops until sundown, arrive late to the gathering. They are exhausted, they are starving, and they find that all the good food is gone.
It's just devastating.
They are relegated to the outer courtyard and left with the meager scraps. They are humiliated right in the middle of what is supposed to be a unifying worship service.
Walters hypothesizes, and the historical evidence strongly supports this, that the wealthy Christian leaders in Corinth weren't just being thoughtlessly greedy, they were consciously treating the Lord's Supper exactly like a Roman patronage banquet.
Using it for politics.
Yes, they were using the communal meal of the church to build their own personal power bases, favoring their own specific clients and friends, reinforcing the strict Roman social hierarchy, and perhaps even subtly challenging Paul's authority as the founder of the community.
It makes me think of modern political fundraising galas. You know, the ones where access and influence are literally determined by the price of your ticket? If you donate $1,000, you get to sit at the VIP table near the microphone and eat steak. If you only donate $50, you're in the overflow room eating a dry chicken breast, watching on a screen. The wealthy Corinthians were bringing that exact same VIP mindset into the kingdom of God.
And Paul's reaction is to absolutely dismantle it. He is telling them that the cross of Christ violently shatters the Roman patronage system. At the table of the Lord, the wealthy patrician with a massive estate and the illiterate public slave who cleans the streets are absolute equals.
There is no VIP table.
There is no VIP table in the kingdom of God. To enforce the Roman social hierarchy during communion is to completely despise the church of God.
It was an incredibly dangerous, radical idea to preach in a city whose entire structure was built on status, ambition, and Roman hierarchy. But digging into these social dynamics highlights something else we absolutely must discuss. When we read Paul's letters addressing these intricate social issues, and when we read Luke's historical narrative of Paul's travels in the book of Acts, we are clearly reading the work of authors who possessed a flawless, nuanced understanding of the exact political realities of their time.
The historical precision is undeniable. And I want to focus on Luke's writing in the book of Acts, because for a very long time during the Enlightenment and the 19th century, highly skeptical scholars aggressively doubted Luke's accuracy.
Right, we mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, they argued that Acts was written a century or more after the events by someone who was just inventing details to create a cohesive theological narrative. They claimed his use of political titles was sloppy and anachronistic.
But the spade of the archaeologist has completely and utterly vindicated Luke. The way he navigates the complex web of Roman administrative titles across different regions is nothing short of staggering.
Let's trace his journey through the titles he uses, starting with what we've already discussed, Corinth. Luke states that Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia. The Greek word he uses is antipatos.
And the Gallio inscription proved that was right.
Exactly. It was the exact, legally correct title for the governor of a senatorial province. But if we go backward in the narrative to Acts chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas are ministering on the island of Cyprus. There they meet a Roman official named Sergius Paulus. And Luke, once again, correctly identifies the ruler of Cyprus as a proconsul, an antipatos.
Which is brilliant because Cyprus was also a senatorial province at that specific time. And we have actually found inscriptions confirming that the Sergian Pauli family had large estates in the region and held that senatorial rank.
The precision continues as Paul moves into Macedonia in Acts chapter 16. He visits the city of Philippi. But Luke doesn't call the leaders of Philippi proconsuls. He calls them magistrates, using the Greek word strategoi, which carries a strong military connotation, like a general or a praetor.
Why the change in title? Why wouldn't they just be mayors or governors?
Because Philippi had a very unique, highly prized status. It was a Roman colony, populated heavily by retired Roman military veterans. The local civic leaders in a Roman colony prided themselves on mimicking the military hierarchy of Rome itself.
Ah, they wanted the military prestige.
They demanded to be called by titles that reflected military authority. Luke knew this specific local vanity, and he recorded their title as strategoi, which fits the historical reality of a Roman colony perfectly.
It is such a granular detail to get right. But then Paul travels down the road to Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17. And this is perhaps one of the most famous examples of Luke's vindication. The local Jewish leaders get angry. They drag a Christian named Jason out of his house, and they bring him before the city officials. The specific Greek word Luke uses for these officials is politarchs.
And for generations, critical scholars pointed to that word and said, Luke made a mistake. We have searched all the classical Greek literature, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and the word politarch doesn't exist. Luke invented a fictional title.
Until the year 1835, archaeologists are working in the modern city of Thessaloniki, and they discover a Roman archway spanning the main street known as the Vardar Gate. And carved right into the stone of the gate is an inscription detailing the civic leadership of the city.
And what did it say?
There it is, carved in stone, the exact rare word Luke used, the politarchs.
And since the discovery of the Vardar Gate, archaeologists have uncovered more than 30 different inscriptions from Macedonia, confirming that politarch was indeed the highly specific, localized title for the magistrates of a free Greek city in that region.
So Luke didn't invent it.
No, the critics just hadn't dug deep enough yet to find it.
Let's give one more example because it shows how vast Luke's knowledge was. In Acts chapter 19, Paul is in the massive city of Ephesus in Asia Minor, and a massive riot breaks out in the theater. Luke casually mentions that Paul had some friends who urged him not to go into the crowd, and he identifies these friends as the Asiarchs.
The Asiarchs were the highest-ranking officials of the province of Asia. They were incredibly wealthy civic leaders who were specifically responsible for funding and overseeing the festivals of the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor.
Wow.
Again, critics questioned the title, but archaeology delivered. We have now recovered over 40 separate inscriptions in Ephesus and the surrounding area, explicitly naming these wealthy officials as Asiarchs.
I look at all this evidence, knowing when to use antipatos in a senatorial province, when to stroke the military ego in a colony with strategoi, when to use a localized term like politarch in a free city, and when to reference the high priests of the imperial cult as Asiarchs. How does grasping that level of meticulous regional accuracy shift the way you read the narrative of Acts?
It demands an incredible level of respect for the text. It tells the historian that we are not reading myth, we are not reading fairy tales, and we are not reading loose theological propaganda written centuries later by someone who didn't know the territory.
Right.
We are reading deeply grounded, rigorously researched history. It bears all the marks of an eyewitness account, or at the very least a historian who had direct, unfettered access to primary eyewitnesses. If Luke is this painstakingly accurate in the small, verifiable, highly localized details of political bureaucracy, it lends immense credibility to his reporting of the larger narrative events, the sermons, and the explosive, miraculous growth of the early church.
Which provides the perfect foundation for our spiritual theme of the week. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to look at a theme we are calling faithfulness in a secular culture, or perhaps more accurately, integrity and truth. We have spent the last hour painting a vivid picture of ancient Corinth. It was a booming, wealthy, ruthlessly ambitious, deeply pagan, and highly political Roman powerhouse. It was a city that worshipped power, sex, and money.
Sounds a bit familiar.
It does. So what does this mean for you today as a believer navigating our modern world?
The encouragement to be drawn from this history is profound. When you look at the cultural landscape today, it is very easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel like the church is fighting a losing battle against a culture that is aggressively secular and morally chaotic.
It's a common feeling.
But we have to remember that the Apostle Paul and the early believers in Corinth navigated an environment that was just as wealthy, just as cosmopolitan, and arguably far more intensely hedonistic and violent than anything we face today.
They were vastly outnumbered. They were living every day under the shadow of the Corinth, surrounded by the overwhelming pagan devotion of the Asclepium, and subjected to the immense, crushing imperial might of Rome.
And yet, they didn't retreat. They didn't build a compound outside the city walls and hide from the culture. They stayed right in the middle of it. Paul sat in the loud, smelly marketplace, stitching leather, talking to whoever would listen.
They engaged.
They did. They shared their faith. They cared for the poor, they defied the Roman patronage system at their dinner tables, and they stood firm in the truth, right in the shadow of the governor's bema.
They knew their faith was grounded in reality.
Exactly, and they proved it with their lives. As believers today, you can stand firm in that same truth, knowing that your faith is not based on clever myths. It is supported by real, rigorous, verifiable historical foundations.
The evidence is there.
From the unbelievably accurate civic titles recorded by Luke, to the chronological timeline anchored in stone by the Gallio Inscription, the roots of the Christian faith are buried deep in the actual dirt of human history. And as we discussed with the debate over the Erastus stone, true faith doesn't need to force the evidence to make itself feel secure. It thrives on honesty, on integrity, and on a commitment to truth, wherever that truth leads.
We can trust the text, and because we can trust the text, we can trust the God behind the text. Now, if you are enjoying this Apostle series, please subscribe and follow the Holy Land Path on this platform so you never miss an episode.
And as we close our time together, I want to leave you with one final fascinating thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time talking about Gallio, the Roman proconsul, who dismissed the case against Paul and inadvertently gave the church a massive legal shield.
A huge moment in history.
We also mentioned that his brother, Seneca, was the personal tutor and closest advisor to the Emperor Nero in Rome. Well, years after Paul left Corinth, he was eventually arrested and imprisoned in Rome. While under house arrest, he writes a letter to the church in Philippi, and he casually mentions that the gospel has reached all the way into Caesar's household.
Wow.
It makes you wonder, just how close did the ripples of Paul's trial in Corinth get to the very pinnacle of the Roman Empire? Did the brilliant, powerful philosopher Seneca ever hear the name of Jesus of Nazareth from the lips of his gentle brother, Gallio?
What an incredible thought to end on. It shows how the seemingly random interactions of history, the movement of ships, and the rulings of indifferent governors are all woven into a grand sovereign design. Until next time, keep walking the ancient paths. Grace and peace to you, and God bless you.